What if the church planning network that is responsible for shaping thousands of churches across America today was also quietly shaping a culture of silence, control, secrecy, and unchecked power? And in part one of this podcast series about ARC, the Association of Related Churches, we unpacked ARC's recommended governance and leadership structure. And even though it's a structure that looks like it's a lot of accountability, we found that it functions at times more like an insulation for the powerful. And it's the kind of leadership and governance structure that, if we're not careful, will make pastors look more like CEOs and kings with unchecked power than pastors of local churches. And if you haven't checked out part one of this series, I highly encourage you go back and check it out right now because this is going to make a lot more sense. But in today's episode, part two, we're going to actually look at the fruit. And we're going to pull back the curtain on ARC's leadership team and some of its more trusted churches, some of its church plants, and we're going to take a deeper look at its business model. We're going to take a deeper look at the systemic patterns that honestly are hiding in plain sight if we know what to look for. And these are patterns that include things like scandal and conflicts of interest and some icky business model practices that at times look more like a multi level marketing scheme than a ministry. And as we get to the end of this episode, we're even going to look in depth at a little known terms of use agreement that if you didn't look for it, you wouldn't know the dangers. But the reality is, it looks like an agreement that could threaten legal action against anyone who dares to talk too openly. And guys, the reality is, this isn't just about ARC. This is about what kind of culture that we're building in the American church and whether we're protecting power or people, whether we're protecting an institution and a corporation, or whether we're protecting an organism, the body of Christ. So, again, if you haven't checked out part one, go check that out now. But here's today's episode: The Secrets of Ark Exposed, part two. Let's get into it. So now that we've seen scandal and spiritual abuse in an art church, and we've seen through Peter Haas's book on this type of church government how the sausage is made, I think that you can probably start to see some of the concern with ARC churches. But there's always the chance that this system could still work really well if the senior pastor and the church staffs involved were people of high integrity. The question, though, is whether banking on leaders to have that kind of integrity is actually realistic. Is it even realistic today? And if we look at ARC leaders and the people who were tied to it right now in this season, will we find leaders who are integrous? Will we find leaders who are living above reproach? Or will we find questions and concerns surrounding them? And as we look further, are we going to see leadership structures in ARC right now that are people full of integrity, that prize integrity? Are we going to find systems that make sure only the most integrous people ever plant churches? Or are we going to find leadership structures that are tied to scandals, connected to scandals? And are we going to find a ripe field for corruption? And in this segment, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look together at the ARC leadership team. Not only the ARC leadership team, we're going to look at speakers who have spoken at ARC events and Church of the Highlands events. We're going to look at some ARC church planters and recent church plants. And we're going to see, are there any connections to scandal? Are there connections to questionable behavior and relationships? Or again, are we finding that high integrity? But we're also in this segment going to hear some important information from two previous ARC lead team members. These weren't just pastors, these were members of the ARC leadership team. And they're going to help us to peel back the curtain and shine some light on how things work at ARC. And that's going to be hearing from Stovall Weems and John Gray. And these two people are not just some schlups, they're not angry castaways. These are two people who, while they were on ARC's leadership team, they were kind of some of the darlings of ARC. They were really highly thought of. And ARC seems like it was pretty good to them too until it wasn't. So let's hear first from Stovall Weems.
Stovall Weems, and I'm here to talk about the state of the church in America.
He's known in some circles of contemporary pastors as Mr. Holy Spirit. And so would you give a outstanding ORU welcome to Stovall Weems? Come on, Stovall.
All right, so when we're talking about Stovall Weems, we're not just talking about a former ARC lead team member, but in these segments, especially this first video that you're hearing, and all this comes from his interview with the Religion Business. If you haven't checked out the Religion Business docuseries, I highly recommend that you do that. There's actually a link in the description below where you can grab that for 10% off. ARC is one of the groups that they discuss, but they don't go very in depth, but they look at a whole lot of things together. But some of the things that Stovall says in these interviews in the Religion Business docuseries is, I think it's very important. And in that first bit of the video that you heard, you're hearing how Stovall was thought of. Stovall was so highly thought of while on the ARC leadership team that you have someone at, I believe, Oral Roberts University introducing him as Mr. Holy Spirit. That's how he was known in some of these circles, not just ARC, but beyond it. This guy was known as someone of integrity. He was speaking on all of the big stages. So, again, this isn't just someone who lacked integrity and got kicked out of ARC and then just got mad about it. This is someone who had been around ARC since the beginning and someone that they all seemed to have a whole lot of respect for. But let's hear about how he connected to ARC, and let's hear a little bit about what Stovall says about how ARC has shifted over the years.
So we planted Celebration Church in 1998, in the fall of 98. And I would say for the first few years, we were on that same train. It's like Jacksonville's a mission field. And I'm hanging with a group of my friends, most of them from Louisiana, a small group of friends. And they had all just planted churches as well. We would start hanging out and sharing ideas and things like that. So then it kind of grew to, hey, there's some other guys planting churches. And it kind of was this thing, well, let's help them, and it was really a lot about, in the beginning, helping the little guy. In the early 2000s, that's when all these conferences started popping up and all these leadership gatherings, and it very much got into church growth, best practices, leadership, corporate leadership, all of those things, and we just kind of went that route. We put together this organization, and it's called ARC, and in the beginning, it was very relational, and I love being a part of it.
What does ARC stand for?
ARC stands for the Association of Related Churches.
All right, so you hear from Stovall there. Stovall says, I was kind of around ARC from the beginning, and it started with just a group of friends from Louisiana wanting to plant some churches. Actually, I'm going to show you before we get any farther into this. Let's go ahead and talk about some of those friends from Louisiana. Who were some of the people who were around toward the beginning of ARC with Stovall? Well, you have Dino Rizzo was around at the beginning. Greg Surratt was around at the beginning. Here are some of these friends from Louisiana as well. Rick Bazette, I believe, was one of those friends from Louisiana hanging out with him as they started this. Chris Hodges was one of those friends from Louisiana helping him to start this organization. Randy Bazette. So you have some of the top people right here on the ARC leadership team who were there from the beginning. When we're talking about Stovall, Stovall was there as this whole thing was designed. And he said, look, we started ARC and it was awesome. At the beginning, it was really relational and I loved it. That's what he said. I loved being a part of ARC. But what did he also say? He said, as in the early to mid 2000s, they started having all these church growth conferences and they started talking about leadership and business principles and church growth. All of that stuff started seeping into ARC and it changed, right? So you have these guys that get together and start this organization years ago for a good purpose. They want to plant 2,000 churches. They want to start good churches everywhere because they're all church planters. But before long, you get into a point where it's all about church growth and it's all about bringing corporate leadership principles into the church. And before you know it, ARC starts looking a little bit more like a big corporate business than that church planning network that it started off as. Now, is ARC all bad? No, absolutely not. There's good things to Ark. But my concern is not that Ark is the evil empire of ministry. My concern is that in its current form, Ark seems ripe for corruption and potential spiritual abuse. It seems ripe for these bad, hurtful, harmful things to happen. And not just things that hurt people, but things that give the church a black eye. Now, I do not want to see Ark go away. That's not my hope. I'm not just an anti Ark guy that hopes Ark closes down and goes away. I want to see Ark reform. I want to see Ark and its leaders embrace accountability, transparency, and protective systems. Now, I may not ever be the biggest fan of Ark. I may not attend an Ark church, but I will tell you this, I want Ark to figure out a way to bring the good things that they've learned, to bring the resources that they have. I want them to find a way to stay doing those good things. But if they don't embrace transparency, if they don't embrace accountability, and if they don't embrace protective systems the way it is today, my fear is that it is a soil so ripe for scandal and spiritual abuse that it's actually a surprise when it doesn't happen. But I want you to listen a little bit more to Stovall, and I think you'll start to see a little bit more of why I'm saying these things.
When everything is operating in good faith, here's the idea of the helping people plant churches, which is really important because the intentions are good. And that is, hey, we're going to sow into you, and so you can plant your church, and then we're expecting that to come back. That's good. That's noble. That is a good thing. But here's what can happen, and here's what happened to Ark, is that power structure grew, and the hierarchy grew, and the control grew, and the money grew. And I would say it's the route of bringing the world, the corporate culture of capitalism and consumerism, just bringing the corporate culture of the world into the church. Those two things are diametrically opposed, and they will always be opposed. One is in place for profit, one is in place for shalom, and never shall the two mix in any type of harmony. And so when there is power there, now you have an avenue for corruption.
Stovall did not mince words at all there, did he? He said the intentions were good, but here's the reality. Good intentions hurt people all the time when they're not paired with accountability, transparency, and protective systems. Okay, so what's Stovall talking about? Stovall is talking about here as more business came in, as more power came in, as more hierarchy came into Ark, as more control came in, as more money came in, things started to turn. And I want you to think about all those ideas. None of those things are necessarily bad in a vacuum. But when we think about the church, when we think about the church that Jesus established, when we think about the fruit of the Spirit, are we describing it with things like power and hierarchy and control and corporate interest and money and leadership growth, right? No, that's not how we're thinking about the church. And what Stovall is saying is, as these things came in, the good intentions all of a sudden got warped. The good intentions got hijacked a little bit. And now, even though the intentions were good, what's actually happening maybe isn't so good. And look, good intentions are great, but intentions don't erase impact. And right now, the reality is the impact of Ark and Ark churches, there's been a lot of good impact, but there's also been a lot of devastating impact, and we have to care about both. But let's continue to listen in and hear what Stovall has to say.
For Ark, more than anything else, and in what I would say as the arms race, as the hierarchy race, the branding race, the monopoly race took off in the American church in the early 2000s. Ark was right in the middle of it and then began to lead it. And so you're dealing with these power structures and hierarchies where so many people are benefiting from them. So many people don't want anything bad to happen to it because they're benefiting from the power or for the money. That's where people start to look the other way when corruption starts to take place.
Wow. What could lead to corruption in a church planting network? Okay. What could cause people to look the other way when sin gets involved? Well, Stovall just gave us a couple of those things: power, money, and a system that gives you both. That could cause people to look the other way. And he said, look, as more power came into this, more money came into this, more people started benefiting from this system. He essentially says that's what's led to people looking the other way when corruption hits. And look, that's essentially just, this is a former ARC lead team member who said these are the kinds of things that came into ARC, and that causes you to look the other way when corruption's there. It sounds like an admission that there is corruption in there, and there are people looking the other way because they benefit from the system. And if they call out the corruption and if they reform the system, then they lose some of the benefits of this system. And that's why it's so important for churches and denominations to decide in advance that you're going to be full of integrity, to decide in advance what are the transparency, accountability, and protective systems we need in place so that we don't go down a road of unchecked power and hierarchy and corruption. We need to make sure that the people who benefit most from the system can't hide the bad things just to keep getting the benefits. Okay. And that's what Stovall is talking about here. Now, we're going to talk about this here in just a few minutes as well, because some of you, I know you're screaming, Jeff, Stovall. I'm not sure you know who Stovall is. You should not be trusting everything Stovall says. Look, I do not trust everything the Stovall says, but I think what he said is interesting. And I think what he says matches a lot of what I see. We're going to talk about it here in just a little bit. Stovall's got some skeletons in his closet. Stovall's got some, maybe I shouldn't say skeletons in his closet. Stovall's got some accusations swirling around him. Okay. Stovall's got some accusations of scandal and misconduct surrounding him as well. But even with that, he's made it a lot worse on himself by speaking out. So when I hear someone speaking out and telling the truth that other people don't want them to tell, I want to hear more, even if I don't completely trust that person. We're going to hear more from Stovall and more about Stovall's story here in just a moment. I do appreciate him speaking out. But what I want to do in this segment, I want to highlight concerns that various leaders in ARC have been connected to, leaders in and around ARC. Now, what I'm also saying, I need you to hear this. I am not saying that any of these people we talk about are guilty of these things. I am in no way pronouncing guilt because I can't know that. All I'm doing is I'm simply pointing out the accusations or the concerns that have publicly swirled around them. This isn't gossip. This isn't just rumor. This is stuff that's been out there in the public. You can Google it. You can look it up. Okay. Now, think about leaders in the church and what the standard for leaders in the church is supposed to be. And you can't say you're the leader or one of the leaders of the Association of Related Churches, a church planning network, and not consider yourself a leader of the church. Okay. Leaders of churches are supposed to be number one above reproach. Okay. So all the more, I think you need to be above reproach for organizations like ARC, where you're not just leading one church, but you're helping to lead and influence thousands of churches. There are over 1,000 churches right now that they planted, but they influence way more than that, because you have the ARC plants, which is I think around 1,100 right now, but you also have the ARC network and member churches. So maybe ARC didn't plant them, but they're running ARC systems, they're doing all that. And then outside of it, you have organizations that are not officially a part of ARC, but they're using ARC stuff, they're using ARC systems, they're using ARC strategy. Okay, so ARC is influencing thousands of churches. Okay, and look, when I'm thinking about leaders of an organization with that kind of influence in the church, some of the stuff we're going to talk about, this feels like a lot more smoke than I would have expected from an organization like ARC. So let's start with the leadership team. We're going to go through. I haven't found questions or concerns about all of these people. So when I don't have concerns, somebody that I don't have good concerns about, then we're really not going to talk about them. But what I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to show this, and I want us to look at these people together. You see right there, ARC churches, this is the lead team. Well, let's start with Dino Rizzo, okay? Does Dino have any questions? Does he have any accusations? Does he have any scandal? Does he have any concerns about sin? Any of that stuff in his past? And guys, I look, I don't want to dig up somebody's past. I don't want to deal with all this. That's not the goal. But if you are leading an organization that's had so much issues, that we got to the point to where we're kind of investigating them, we've got to look at the leaders, okay? And you know, when you're a leader of something like this, you're going to be put in the spotlight. So I'm not trying to trash any of these guys. I'm not trying to trash Dino. I don't know them. I'm sure that overall they're probably some good people. I'm sure there's probably some false concerns in some of these situations, but I think it's important. You hear the old phrase, "Where there's smoke, there's fire." We need to look and see, are these people above reproach? Are they above reproach in the biblical way, or is there a lot of smoke surrounding these people? And maybe if there's not fire, it still would mean that they're not above reproach. So let's look at Dino real quick. Dino was actually a pastor at a very large church in Louisiana called the Healing Place. And in 2012, he was removed there because of having an affair, an inappropriate relationship with a staff member. Now, today, we would call that, most likely, we would call that adult clergy SA. And it's adult clergy SA because if you're a pastor, whether it's a person in your congregation or a person on your staff, there's an imbalance of power there. So it's hard to just be an affair. It's actually adult clergy SA. Okay. Now that happened in 2012. The very next year, 2012, he's removed from this church because of this relationship. The very next year, guys, he joins the staff of Church of the Highlands. And that same year, he started leading ARC, the Association of Related Churches, as the executive director. And that's why you see him right here as the executive director of ARC, Dino. And Dino has been leading ARC ever since. But that means he's been leading ARC for 12 years, and the leader of ARC started leading ARC within a year after being removed from his own church because of sin and scandal. Now, let's go back, and I want you to hear a couple of things that were in a Christian Post article about this when it happened, okay? They actually interviewed one of the Healing Place's overseers. And remember, in the governance structure, we talked about overseers being the people who hold the pastor accountable when there's sin, okay? Well, guess who the overseer was that the Christian Post interviewed? It was none other than Chris Hodges, senior pastor at the time of Church of the Highlands and one of the founders of ARC. Here's what it said, okay? Acknowledging the lack of clarity provided by the Rizzos as to why they were stepping down, because there were a lot of questions at the time, Chris Hodges, an overseer of the Healing Place and pastor of Church of the Highlands in Birmingham, Alabama, asked the congregation to just accept that the 7 overseers of the church know the whole situation. So let's pause. Let's stop. Does that quote by the Christian Post, that quote from overseer Chris Hodges, does it remind you of anything we've already heard in this podcast, in this investigation about ARC? It reminds me of Jordan Carter. It reminds me of the overseer with Thrive City. When Emma said, how are you going to hold Ben Tubbs accountable? Are you going to tell the other overseers? And he said, hey, you're really just going to have to trust that I'm doing my job as an overseer. We're going to take care of this. Just trust me. Okay. And they continued with this quote from the Christian Post. We're going to take care of them. This is Chris Hodges. We're going to take care of them, and we're going to take care of you. Trust me, Hodges said during one of the Healing Places services. Okay. So, hey, we're going to take care of this. Y'all just got to trust me. Does that sound familiar to you? Because it does sound familiar to me. So as we start out and we're looking, the very first leader here, the executive director of ARC, there's integrity concerns in his past. And it just makes me wonder, okay, if he had those integrity concerns, Chris Hodges was one of his overseers, and that overseer, as a part of taking care of him, put him into a position of power leading ARC in the next year. Should it surprise us if the leader of ARC started leading ARC a year after sexual sin? Should it surprise us that we've seen quite a few pastors of ARC fall into sexual sin and have to be removed? But that's with Dino. Let's check. Maybe that's just one person. Maybe it's just an isolated incident. Let's look at Greg Surratt. Right here, the second person, Greg Surratt. Greg is the senior pastor of Seacoast Church. Okay. He is the founder, credited as being the actual founder of ARC. He's in a lot of their videos. He's always been very involved. Are there any concerns with Greg? Now, Greg doesn't have any sin that's caused him to be removed or anything like Dino, but there are some questions and concerns. In February 2022, Okay, and you can check this out on the Roy's Report. But Greg urged his congregation in a sermon. He's preaching a sermon from the pulpit, and he urged them to do what sounds like pray judgment over their persecutors. To me, it sounded like a weaponized sermon against his critics, asking the church to pray judgment on people who would ask questions. Okay, also, a few years back, you had some pastors come out who said, hey, ARC requires the churches, as long as they're a part of ARC, they're required to pay 2% of their annual revenue back into ARC. You're actually going to hear the same thing from Stovall Weems. But Greg comes out and basically kind of, accuses those people of lying. He claimed that the 2% annual revenue payments were voluntary, even though, again, other ARC pastors said otherwise, and seriously question that. It seems to me like being a part of ARC is voluntary, but as long as you're a part of ARC, giving the 2% is not voluntary. So there's questions around that. His story doesn't line up with what other people have said. Okay. And no other current ARC people are talking. They're not given contracts or agreements or anything like that. So we wouldn't know. Now, Craig is also connected to and has supported multiple pastors who were involved in moral failure and sin. Okay. He was connected, just like all these guys were connected to people like Mekon Carter and John Gray. So does any of that mean that Greg Surratt is disqualified from being a pastor? No. But are there reasonable questions, things that would lead to reproach with Greg Surratt? I would say, yes. Okay. So let's go to the next person, Rick Bezet. The next leader here, Rick Bezet. Rick, haven't found a whole lot about Rick. We had to read a book that Rick wrote on staff when I was at another church. He was a friend of our pastors, right? All that. So I've only heard good things about Rick. The only question that I've found about Rick was his name was attached to and connected to the Hillsong celebrity preacher scam. Now, you may be asking, Jeff, what is the celebrity preacher scam? I'm going to go ahead and pull that up through the Roy's Report. Analysis, ARC pastors enriched through Hillsong celebrity preacher scam. You can go through, you can look at that, you can read that on your own. Okay, I've talked about it previously, but essentially a whistleblower provided documents. And you see screenshots of the documents there of people who were a part of the Hillsong network, who these pastors were essentially speaking for each other, okay, speaking at Hillsong events, having Hillsong people speak at their events, each other, and they were taking honorariums that were essentially, you're looking at anywhere from 10 to about $25,000, $30,000 a pop. Okay, so there was a lot of pastor buddies speaking for each other at their churches and events. You pay to be a part of this network, and then if you're in this network, you're preaching at each other's churches, and man, you're making tens of thousands of dollars every time you preach above and beyond your income. Okay. So that's the only thing that I have seen from Rick Bezet. You're going to see multiple people, because if you looked at that article wasn't just about the celebrity preacher scam. It was about ARC's ties to it. ARC was very heavily tied to it. A lot of these leadership team names appear in those documents. So not huge concerns with Rick, but the fact that he was tied to that, it is a concern. So let's look at Chris Hodges. Okay, Chris Hodges is next right up here. Chris is very beloved. Chris is the longtime pastor and founder of Church of the Highlands. He's one of the founders of ARC. ARC is now run out of Church of the Highlands. When people think of ARC, they think of Chris Hodges. Okay, now Chris was also connected to the celebrity preacher scam. Okay, so that's one of the first things that we're going to be concerned about there. Now, Chris has other troubling connections as well. He has connections to, or even attempts to restore, people like Mekon Carter, John Gray, and he was connected to Robert Morris and other people like that. Okay, now just being connected to someone who has a scandal, that doesn't mean anything, but I think it is important to ask, do you have those connections? Okay. This was something that a lot of people have even forgot about. But in 2020, he had to apologize publicly. He came under fire because he was liking racially insensitive political posts. In 2020, when the racial tensions were really high, he was liking a lot of political posts. And because of who he is, because he's a big name pastor, people were paying attention to that. It ruffled a lot of feathers. So he had some reproach there. He apologized. He's also been named in a few different lawsuits regarding ARC over the recent years, including a lawsuit that Stovall Weems has actually filed. In 2017, and again, guys, I'm not trying to just dig up people's past, but I think this is important. We got to ask, how above reproach are these people? In 2017, Chris Hodges' son worked at Church of the Highlands, and he was removed for an unspecified moral failure. This is part of the problem that I have with Chris Hodges. Okay, is he responsible for what his son did? No, but in all of these things, even going back with Dino, a lot of times details are left out. We're not specifying these things. 1 Timothy 5:20 says that a sinning elder is to be rebuked in front of all so that others will be scared to do the same. Okay. We still don't know what happened with his son or why his son was removed. There's still hush hush on all of that. And then kind of the final set of questions or concerns that would come up with Chris Hodges, because again, none of these are disqualifying in a vacuum, but they are reproach, and they're reproach that right now hasn't been answered. Um, but this is a small one, but I do think it's important. Chris handed off leadership at Church of the Highlands to Mark Pettis abruptly and without a vote earlier this year. Now, again, if we go back to the book that Peter Haas wrote about this hybrid form of governance, one of the things that the church is supposed to do, one of the only things the congregation is supposed to do that gives them any sort of authority in that hybrid form of government, is that they pick their senior pastor. Yet it doesn't sound like the overseers, the elders, the trustees, the church, doesn't sound like anybody picked their senior pastor. It sounds like Chris Hodges decided and then told everybody else, and it happened very abruptly. Okay, which just again, it brings back that reproach question of are these pastors operating like kings and CEOs who can appoint their successors without having to get anybody on board? Okay, so we've made it through really just this first row of leaders, and we've found at least some questions around all of them. Now, as you get to the next one, Randy Bezet, I couldn't find anything concerning. Joe Champion, I couldn't find anything concerning. With Stephen Chandler. Now, Stephen Chandler is the pastor of, I believe it's Union Church in Maryland. No, again, no massive concerns, but I think these things matter when we're looking at if this system requires that you have like super integrity leaders. Is that what we're finding here, or is there a lot of reproach? Okay, so let's think about when I started looking at Stephen Chandler. He had a 2023 sermon where he essentially said, if you don't tithe, you can't eat here at this church. Essentially, he even said that if you don't tithe, you're going to have a hard time hearing from God. Okay, now, Stephen's also, there have been some accusations of him wearing and flaunting lavish clothing and accessories that at times have been said to be worth more than the average congregant's mortgage. Okay, so there's some of those concerns. It's not the end of the world, but this is one of the leaders of a church planting network, so it is some reproach. I've also seen, and again, most of this we're talking about is public. I've got some things, I've got receipts on some of these. I've seen some just kind of icky things from the church that people have sent. Like this particular church has a style guide for volunteers that suggest how they dress to not only keep from distraction but to look more stylish and trendy. Is it bad? Is it sinful? No, but it felt icky looking at it. Okay, so when you're looking at Stephen Chandler, here's the reality. Is there scandal? No. Is there moral failure? No. But is there some concerning and questionable behavior? I'd have to say yes. It's like concerns, but there are concerns and questions. You see, if you keep looking over here, we go through. I didn't see anything about Herbert Cooper or Chad Fisher. Daniel Floyd. Daniel Floyd. I didn't find anything about Daniel Floyd other than the fact that Daniel is the new pastor of Gateway. And if you remember, that's a connection to scandal simply because Gateway is where Robert Morris was at, where you had elders who apparently knew about his relationship with Cindy Clemishere when she was a minor. Okay, he's now indicted for that in Oklahoma, going through trial. Okay, Daniel's who took over after that. So there's a lot of things swirling around Gateway. We're going to talk about here in a minute as well. Robert Morris was connected to Church of the Highlands before that. So nothing that concerns me about Daniel, but Daniel is who Gateway has connected themselves to, and they're just coming out of scandal. So it is important to note. Now with Matt Fry is the next person you see from Hope Front Church, not super well known. Matt Fry, I couldn't find any scandals or moral failure, but I did want to at least note here, I've had some really negative interactions with his son on social media. His son, who is also a staff member at the church. Okay. And when I looked into them because of those negative interactions, over a year ago, it looks like, their kids are on staff or have all been on staff at some point. So, nothing public there with them. But if you look at the church, there is the appearance of nepotism. Maybe it's not. Maybe they are the most qualified people on the planet for that. We ask churches to have an anti-nepotism policy and to have disclosures for any family on staff, just so that people know, and to have policies to make sure that those are the best people to be on staff. I don't know if they have any of those, but because I don't know that, there's at least the appearance of nepotism there. That's the only concern that I could find with him. The next person you see is Pete Haas. And if Peter Haas sounds familiar, it's because he's the one who wrote that book we looked at about the hybrid form of church governance and why ARC supports it and gave the sample constitution. And so this is one of the architects behind this form of church governance where the pastor is almost impossible to hold accountable. He literally wrote the book on ARC governance that gives the pastor almost unchecked power that has the appearance of accountability, but doesn't really have accountability. Okay. Now, again, I didn't find anything about Matt Keller or Rob Ketterling, but you see Obed Martinez there. Okay. And again, guys, a lot of this stuff is small, but you're starting to see there's a lot of smoke here. A lot of smoke here in a system that needs almost absolute integrity to fight against corruption because these pastors are given almost unchecked power. Well, Obed Martinez, if you go back and you look at podcast episodes that we did in year one of the people that we looked at was Albert Tate, because Albert Tate came under fire for an inappropriate relationship in his church, and his church was demanding accountability. And they had a really rough meeting with the church members and some of the overseers and stuff like that. Well, Obed Martinez was actually in those videos, given some pretty, I would say, crappy answers to people who wanted to get some transparent and accountable answers about what was going on. They had a lot of concerns about the church, including the use of NDAs and hush money. Obed was one of the overseers involved with the Albert Tate allegations. And guys, I just do not think that he did a very good job at all there. A lot of concerns from me. Next, you're going to see Miles McPherson, former NFL player. He, is the pastor of the Rock Church. As far as Miles, the concerns aren't about Miles directly, but they're about things around Miles. Okay, so at Miles Church, you can look this up. Of course, there are news articles with it, but a former elder at the church was charged with the deletion and torture of their 11-year-old daughter. Now, he came out and he said, man, we're heartbroken. We didn't know about this. But this is someone, guys, this is someone who was an elder at this church who was doing this and no one knew. That's really serious, and it does invite questions of how no one knew. But you may say, Jeff, sometimes we all get duped. Here's the problem, though. The victim's father, who actually talked with the Roy's report about this, okay, he said he warned the church. According to the Roy's report, he said he warned the church about suspected abuse years ago, but the staff ignored him. Okay, so again, if that's true, that's pretty damning. That's pretty destructive. Okay, because now you got this child who is no longer living because of these actions, right? Because of the actions of a former elder. Also, Miles, this is the only other thing that I could find about Miles. That one was heavy. This is less heavy, but Miles was also connected to the celebrity preacher scam. All right, next up, we're going to see Todd Mullins. Todd, remember, the pastor of Christ Fellowship, the son of Tom. Okay, not a ton about Todd, but just a couple of concerns. One, Todd is tied again to the celebrity preacher scam. You go through, you look at those documents, he is on there. Okay. Also, and again, a small concern, but one that comes up a lot with these churches, and it goes back to that unchecked power thing. Todd took over from his dad. It has the appearance of nepotism. It has the appearance of just handing down a succession. I don't know all the information involved in that, but when you have one of the largest churches in the country and you just give it to your son, that is always going to invite reproach unless you have systems and policies in place and are very upfront about how all of this stuff works. The next person you're going to see there is Sean Nepstad. Now, I don't know anything about Sean Nepstad. I don't know anything about his church until I looked him up. Okay, this was a new one for me. But when I looked him up, his name came up in some articles about a lawsuit. And apparently he was named in a lawsuit that had accusations of negligence, had accusations of cover up concerning a pastor who allegedly SA'd a staff member. Okay, so you can find that on the Roy's report. I think you can find it in some other places as well. But he was named in that lawsuit because it looks like he was an overseer of the church and the pastor in question. So again, you get the SA of a staff member, and it looks like they were saying, hey, he was one of the overseers that should have known about this. I don't know what happened in that lawsuit. I don't know if there was truth to that. But again, you got this idea of we've got handpicked overseers who are friends of the pastor, who are in the bylaws supposed to hold the pastor accountable, but we've seen a difficulty with accountability issues. And now you find out this ARC lead team member was named in a lawsuit, I believe, along with Dino Rizzo, about, hey, people saying, you should have known, you're connected to this. Okay. Next, you see Dell and Terry O'Shields. Couldn't find anything publicly about them or Dave Patterson. Nothing about Benny Perez. The next person you see, though, is John Siebling of the Life Church in Memphis, Tennessee, not too far away from where I'm at. Okay. Didn't find a lot about John. I've heard a lot of good things about John, but John looks to be included in a lawsuit from Stovall Weems, who we've been hearing from, as one of the former overseers of Celebration Church in Jacksonville. Okay. And in that lawsuit, Stovall accuses some of the ARC leaders and his overseers at his church of basically forcing a takeover, doing a hostile takeover and forcing him out by ARC so that they could control Celebration. Now, again, I don't know if any of that is true, but this is more smoke of, you have Stovall, who was one of the lead team members of ARC, and he's got other lead team members of ARC who he's good friends with. One of those is John, who is his overseer. And then he gets removed. And after we've seen the difficulty of overseers removing a lot of these people, and as we've seen the overseers many times, just like Chris Hodges, not want to give a lot of details about why somebody was removed. Well, in Stovall's case, they just threw him under the bus pretty hard. They threw him under the bus. They blamed everything on him. So that is there. John was named in that lawsuit. Okay. The next one that you see, is we're almost done with this list. You see Casey Treat of Christian Faith Church. Now, I didn't know anything about him either, had to look it up. But Casey, it looks like, has been connected to multiple lawsuits in 2017 and 2018 that regard accusations of inappropriate relationships and an abuse of power between his son, Caleb Treat, and a former pastor or a former staff person at their church. Okay. The 2017 lawsuit, as far as I can tell, it looks like it was settled before going to trial. Okay. But according to the Roy's report, when the suit was active, so while this lawsuit was active, alleging misconduct and inappropriate relationship between Casey's son, Caleb, and another staff member, because Caleb was on staff. While that was active, the Roy's report says that he went to Alabama and served as a central student pastor or a central student director at Church of the Highlands. So again, you've got Chris Hodges is known for wanting to restore these pastors and everything else. To me, it's a bad look, and it invites a lot of questions. If you got a staff member at a church working with his dad accused of something that could be considered adult clergy SA, and while that lawsuit is active and ongoing, you hire him and bring him to your church across the country. Okay. So those are the big concerns with Casey Treat. Casey is also connected to the celebrity preacher scam with Hillsong, if I'm not mistaken, and he looks to have been very connected to and very good friends with embattled Brian Houston. Brian Houston has all kinds of smoke around him. If you remember, and we'll talk about Brian here in a minute, but all kinds of stuff going on with Brian. It looks like they weren't just connected through the Hillsong network and the celebrity preacher scam, but they were connected, guys, through just a big friendship. So we made it all the way through ARC's lead team. Okay. And you may be saying, Jeff, that feels weird. Why are you looking up all these guys past? Here's the reason. Again, this is a system that we've already seen big concerns with. You need people of integrity leading it for it to have a chance, in my opinion. Well, when I looked at ARC's lead team, okay, and I looked at this, 13 out of the 24 that I looked at, that's 54%. 54% of the leadership team, when I looked at them, have been connected to either scandal, moral failure, or some sort of questionable behavior from my best understanding and research. Now, the reality is at the same time, most of this is not terrible. It's not disqualifying stuff, but it is a lot of smoke for me. So if you try to tell me, Jeff, there's nothing there, there's no concerns here, this thing is led with integrity, guys, there's too much smoke for me to believe that. I've got to just say that there's a lot going on. Some of this is likely going to be true when you have this many accusations. But even if it's not, you got to think, what does scripture say? Scripture says that leaders of the church, elders, are supposed to be above reproach. This doesn't feel like the level of above reproach that I would be looking for with people with this kind of influence over the local church. And guys, it's not just a lot of smoke, it's a whole lot of smoke for the leaders in one room in one organization. 54% had some pretty significant questions that you could dig up just by looking it up publicly. Okay. Now, when you look at previous ARC lead team members, are there any previous ARC lead team members that you wouldn't find on that webpage right now who have questions? Well, we got Stovall Weems. He is one that we've heard from already, but let's look at this with Stovall. If you're not familiar with the stuff that's going on with Stovall, you see that Stovall has accusations of not just being a part of the celebrity preacher scam, but he was ousted from his mega church, right? And he said he sued ARC because he alleged a conspiracy and deception, and that was a hostile takeover. Okay. Now, they have accused him of unjustly enriching himself. They've accused him of financial scandal and fraud. Okay. Now, you've also got issues with defaulted bank loans. You've got lawsuits going back and forth between them. You got a lot of concerns there. Okay. That's Stovall, though. And when you look at Stovall, you got the accusations of financial scandal and fraud. He says he was framed. He says it was a conspiracy and hostile takeover by ARC. And he says that happened when he started pushing back, if I understand correctly, against some of the business model aspects of ARC. Okay. But you've also got John Gray. Up until just recently, John Gray was a lead team member of ARC, well-known speaker. Okay. John Gray, though, you see this headline right here. He apologizes on a podcast for his struggles with marriage and infidelity. Okay. Well, John Gray's been a part of different legal disputes, and he has been accused of multiple cheating and financial scandals. Okay. So, again, you look stuff up, there's a lot there publicly. There's a lot of questions. I'm not saying whether John is guilty or not. I can't say any of that. Some of the stuff that he's owned up to, it sounds like there were emotional affairs at minimum. Okay. This is also the same guy that, after all of those accusations and stuff, bought, I believe, a $200,000 Lamborghini for his wife, which is not a great look for a pastor, especially a pastor of a church that's had financial scandal of its own and was embroiled in lawsuits with another church. But when we look at this article, find out a little bit more about John Gray, you see that John Gray was apologizing to his wife. But look right here. Gray previously served as a member of the lead team of the Association of Related Churches. Okay. He was listed as recently as April 2022. Okay. So it wasn't just Stovall with the stuff surrounding him, a former lead team member, but now you have John Gray, who is a former lead team member. He says something else I want to note before we move on, because sometimes with these pastors, you got to wonder when they say things, are they saying the quiet part out loud? Okay. You got to wonder, is Stovall making all this stuff up, or is Stovall saying some of the quiet part out loud? I think the same thing is true with John. Okay. Read this right here. Having remained the lead pastor at his church through various controversies, Gray said he received little help from his brothers in ministry while he went through his struggles. And he says this is very, very concerning to me from a former ARC lead team member. He says, do you know what it's like to wait for your brothers in the ministry to come to your aid? And when you're hurting, nobody shows up because their stuff is actually worse than the stuff you're dealing with. And again, we're talking about financial scandal. We're talking about, affairs. We're talking about that kind of stuff. Those are the accusations that are levied against John Gray. That's the kind of stuff that he is dealing with, sexual sin. Okay. And he says, you're hurting. You need your brothers in the ministry. And nobody shows up because their stuff is actually worse than the stuff you're dealing with. But they don't want anybody looking at them, so they won't come near you. Now, it says that Gray did not specify who he was alluding to with these remarks. But let's look at this again. When this stuff is going on, he was a part of the ARC lead team. And he says, I'm waiting on my brothers in ministry. Now, again, I'm not naming them specifically, but were the ARC leaders and the lead team, were they his brothers in ministry? I would say absolutely. Okay, they qualify. But he said, nobody shows up. Nobody. That sounds like it would include the ARC lead team. I mean, I'm spitballing here. I'm having to make assumptions that I'm not saying this is what happened because no one can know. But John's saying, do you know what it's like to wait on your brothers to come to you? Nobody, none of your brothers in ministry come to you because their stuff is worse than your stuff and they don't want anybody looking at them. So they don't want to be anywhere around you. That right there is majorly concerning to me. Majorly concerning to me because it makes me wonder, guys. It just makes me wonder. Are some of these guys covering for each other? Are some of these guys leaving? Are some of these guys separating because they don't want to be tied to a scandal because they don't want anybody looking any deeper in what they're dealing with? Okay, we're going to talk about Tavner Smith here in just a little bit. Tavner went through that when it appears that his overseers quit because they didn't want to be tied to his scandal. So is John Gray just saying stuff, or is John Gray saying some of the quiet part out loud? Regardless, the fact that a former ARC lead team member said, you can be going through stuff as a pastor and nobody wants to touch it because the stuff they're going through is worse than yours and they don't want to get caught. That should tell us something. If it doesn't tell us anything about ARC, it should tell us something about the greater celebrity pastor culture and why some of these pastors are covering for each other. But it's not just John Gray. It's not just Stovall Weems. You see right there, Robert Morris. And if you didn't know, Robert Morris, who has been a part of one of the grossest scandals that I've ever had to cover in church. Okay. Robert, before he resigned, days before he resigned at Gateway, he had to resign from Church of the Highlands because he was an overseer for Church of the Highlands. Now, again, does that mean that Church of the Highlands knew what was going on with Robert Morris? Absolutely not. Okay. But you got ARC and Church of the Highlands. You got a lot of these churches that are pretty charismatic. And you may not know that about Church of the Highlands, but they're what I would call closet charismatic. They don't really promote the charismatic stuff. But when you get into freedom and everything else, they're definitely charismatic. They're definitely gifts of the Spirit. It's hard for me to believe that none of them had the discernment to know something was going wrong with Robert. Okay, so if you don't have the discernment, nobody there has the discernment to know something's going on with Robert, then maybe you're just not exercising those gifts the way that you would talk about. Okay, but again, that's more smoke. People connected to ARC. You got the leadership team so far. You got former lead team members like John Gray and Stovall Weems. And then you have a former overseer of Church of the Highlands who was also, even though he wasn't an ARC church connected to ARC, speaking at different events, speaking at Church of the Highlands, stuff like that, in Robert Morris. Okay. So that's just the lead team members and a former overseer of ARC. So the next thing I want to look at, let's look at some speakers at ARC events, at Church of the Highlands events. And let's just see, are there any other people publicly attached to them that have questions or scandal? Again, because we're just trying to look and see, should we have questions about this organization, or is stuff like Thrive City a flash in the pan? Okay. Is it a flash in the pan, or is this becoming a pattern? We have to ask these questions, because when you have a lot of scandal or a lot of questions or a lot of concerns surrounding a bunch of people around one organization, then at that point, I think you got to say this structure is allowing for some of these things to happen. Okay, at least the structure is not stopping it. So let's look at some of these previous speakers, because I always say you can tell a lot about a ministry often by looking at who they invite to be on their stage and to be on their events. Because if you look in those bylaws, again, the only person who can decide in that form of governance, if they have those bylaws, The only person who can decide who is on the stage outside of the senior pastor is the senior pastor. Okay. Now, again, when we look at these speakers, I want you to know these are well sought after, well known celebrity pastor speakers. And I have been involved in these events. I've been involved in having to write the checks for some of these things. Okay. So I know what I'm talking about when I talk about this. Most of these speakers we're talking about would easily command somewhere between $10 and $30,000 per speaking engagement. Okay. And we see that in the celebrity preacher scam. Okay. So all of these people would seem to be good candidates to benefit monetarily from ARC, because if you're speaking at ARC or you're speaking at Church of the Highlands, you want to stay in their good graces, because that would bring in, it would seem, a lot of money from for you from ARC. And if you remember Stovall Weems actually talking about that, he said, what would lead people to cover up corruption when they see it? Well, one of the things that would lead to that is when you benefit from the organization and you benefit from that being known. But I want to listen to Stovall one more time from his interview. I want to listen again, and he's going to talk a little bit about this kind of conflict of interest that is created when all of these buddies and friends are making so much money from each other in the system.
When Celebration Church was at its peak, 20,000 members, it's cranking on all cylinders. You're founding member of ARC, ARC's flying. Who were you rubbing elbows with, and what stages were you standing on?
I definitely saw it as a ministry, as a church, bringing Jesus to the world. I think that, the church just got so large and there were so many business aspects of the church.
Who were you rubbing elbows with, and what stages were you standing on?
I mean, at its height and during that season, I pretty much spoke at most of the conferences around the world. And I spoke at most of the churches, I would say, of, pastors that were megachurch pastors and had really big influential churches. And they spoke at my church. And so I would say, definitely Hillsong. I would, Stephen Furtick, Ed Young, T.D. Jakes, Joyce Meyer, Carl Lentz, John Gray, definitely ARC, Robert Morris, pretty much kind of who people think.
So you were rubbing elbows with all the big boys and girls.
Yes, I guess I was.
The sad part about that is all those big boys and girls that Nathan Atfill was talking about. When you hear those names, you hear a lot of those names that have been embroiled in scandal, from Robert Morris to Carl Lentz to Brian Houston, right? You hear all of those. But did you hear, as Stovall was talking about that, he's like, hey, I was at all their conferences. I was at their churches and they were at my church. Do you see the conflict of interest that is created in these kind of speaker circuits? Okay. Hey, I only make this much from my church, but people don't know that. But even if they found that out, they don't know what I make in a housing allowance. But even if they found that out, they don't realize how much I'm making outside of the church just from the good old boy network. I invite you to my church and pay you $10,000, $20,000 to speak. You invite me to your church and pay $10,000 to $20,000 to speak. I'm speaking a few sermons for a few services, and now I have made $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. Okay. What he just described was really the Hillsong celebrity preacher scam, but he's saying it went much farther than that. Okay. And that's what he was doing. All these ARC guys were speaking for each other. People at Hillsong were speaking for each other. And it becomes a group of people where, again, a conflict of interest is created. It's important for us to cover for each other if we can, because I benefit from you staying in power. So again, and I'm just going to say this, right? I'm not saying that Stovall knew and that he was covering for somebody like Robert Morris, but if you're speaking at Robert Morris's church and you're making every couple of years or even every year, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 from speaking at his church or speaking at his events or speaking at conferences that he's tied to, then if you know what's going on with Robert Morris, you have incentive to hide that. If you're connected with Carl Lentz and you know what's going on with Carl Lentz or you suspect it, there's incentive to hide that. Same thing with Brian Houston, okay? Time and time and time again, that's what creates that overlooking corruption that Stovall himself talked about. So let's look at some of these speakers who have been connected to ARC events, or Church of the Highlands and its events. You have Brian Houston, the former senior pastor and founder of Hillsong. Okay. Well, what's some of the smoke surrounding and the scandal surrounding Brian? If you don't know, well, Brian was convicted of a DUI. Okay. Brian, one of the things that led to him being removed from Hillsong were reports of him stumbling drunk into a woman's room, a hotel room at Hillsong conference one year. there were accusations of cover up that he covered up his father's sin, with minors. Now, again, the court cases, as far as I understand, found him not guilty, but there was a lot of stuff swirling around that for years. There have been accusations of misconduct and leadership abuses. Again, he was at the center of the celebrity preacher scam, and around Brian Houston and Hillsong, there's been connections to NDA use to silence whistleblowers. Okay. So that's Brian Houston connected to Ark Church of the Highlands and these ministries. You also have John Lindell. John Lindell of James River Church that we talked about had a controversy with Mark Driscoll a couple of years ago that was very, very public, but he has spoken at these events. He's been connected to them. He's been connected to a lot of questions and accusations about lavish entertainment and spending on conferences for years. He was connected to a toe growth miracle where apparently they prayed over someone and their toe regrew at James River. But there's been a ton of controversy swirling around that, and people who said that is not true, and there's not been any claims to back up that it was true. That swirled around years ago. And there's also been a lot of concerns that have been raised by different former members about them having unilateral control over church government, something we've talked about in this podcast. That there have been conflicts of interest. Both of his sons work on the church staff there, and it looks like one of them, if not both of them, are going to take over after him. There's been accusations and things about suppression of accountability, deceptive financial practices, nepotism. Again, I can't tell you what's true and what's not. All I can say is that stuff has swirled fairly publicly around him. Okay. You have Larry Stockstill. A lot of people love Larry Stockstill. I have met Pastor Larry. Pastor Larry has prayed over me. I have seen nothing but good out of Pastor Larry. Okay. He's out of Bethany Church in Louisiana. Okay. But Larry Stockstill was Chris Hodges' pastor. He's been very connected to a lot of these things, very connected to a lot of people at Ark. His son, Jonathan, I believe, took over for him as the pastor at Bethany. He was accused years ago of abusing interns with an extreme boot camp type of event. That was actually on NBC News. Okay. And then, of course, when you look at the son taking over the church, there's this look of a nepotistic hand down of the church to son. You have people like Chad Veach, who has speak there. Now, Chad Veach, I haven't seen a ton around him, but he is connected to the celebrity preacher scam. You had people like Stephen Furtick, who has preached there. Now, Stephen doesn't have any super heavy scandal, but Stephen is kind of a lightning rod for criticism. Okay. There's been criticism of financial transparency and wealth concerns. There's been a huge controversy about a decade ago about spontaneous baptisms and were those faked, and did they have a whole playbook that told people to fake spontaneous baptisms? And I believe he's denied all of that, but that did not look good. So again, no big scandal with Stephen Furtick, but a lot of questions. You've had Jimmy Evans speak around Ark and Church of the Highlands. Jimmy Evans he's been surrounded by a lot. Jimmy Evans was, first of all, I think the number one indictment. He was one of the guys that restored Mark Driscoll. Okay. My opinion, Mark Driscoll should not be in ministry anywhere ever. Okay. But Jimmy Evans was also the one who was caught in a recording exhibiting spiritually abusive behavior in a meeting with Jonathan Lamb, where he told Jonathan Lamb that his mom, Joni Lamb, at Daystar Television was the voice of God to him, and that he needed to listen to her like God. Okay. Jimmy was also an elder at Gateway, and according to court disclosures, as far as I understand it, it's likely and reported that he knew about Cindy Clemishere and was informed about Robert Morris's SA of a minor. So tons of questions around Jimmy Evans. And then you have people like John Bevere. Now, again, John Bevere, no huge, massive scandal. Okay. I know people who love John. I've talked about John and some of his really questionable, concerning teachings that could be used in spiritual abuse. I've actually talked about that on this channel. But when you look at John Bevere is another person that's taught there. He's got ties to Benny Hinn. Okay. There's quite a few unbiblical teachings like undercover and the bait of Satan that whether you agree with them or not, they've been used in spiritually abusive environments to keep people under control and to silence them. At least that's what victims feel like. And there's some links to the New Apostolic Reformation from him. Now, again, we've looked at the ARC lead team, we've looked at former lead team members, we looked at a former overseer of Church of the Highlands, and we've looked at a bunch of speakers and well-known pastors who have been connected to their events. And guys, you don't have to look very far to see question after question after question, accusation after accusation after accusation, and some of them very proven, very public scandal. But we're not quite done yet. I want you to go back and I want us to look together at the ARC leadership team. Remember all of these guys? Remember all of these guys? I want you to think about this group of about 24 people on this leadership team. And I want us to talk about the conflict of interest, okay? How many of these guys have spoken at each other's churches? Let's just look right here. How many of these guys have spoken at Church of the Highlands or ARC events? And look, it is likely that they were, again, paid a nice honorarium. Honor's huge in these cultures. You're not going to ask someone to speak for you for free. And I know in events like this that you pay big honorariums. So I would be incredibly surprised if these people weren't paid those honorariums of $10,000 to $30,000 per time that they spoke. Okay. So here are some of the leadership team that have spoken, likely as paid speakers, at ARC events, Church of the Highlands events, many of them multiple times. Greg Surratt, Dave Patterson, Miles McPherson, Sean Nepstad, Herbert Cooper, Willie George, Christine Kane, who, by the way, I hadn't mentioned Christine yet. Christine is one of the former lead team members of ARC, I believe. Carolyn Haas, who is Peter Haas's wife, the one who wrote the book on this hybrid form of church governance, and John Siebling. Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 9 people on the leadership team here with ARC who have spoken at ARC events, Church of the Highlands, each other's churches. Does that not create a conflict of interest? From my vantage point, that creates a massive conflict of interest. How are you going to hold other people accountable if your bread is buttered by those people? Okay. What does it benefit you to expose corruption or sin if it is there, if exposing that sin and corruption costs you money? Just like Stovall said earlier. Now I hope you're thinking about this the way that I am. I'm now thinking back to why did Stovall say what he said? And this is starting to make a little bit more sense. He says it's easy to overlook corruption. What would make you overlook corruption? Well, when you benefit from the system staying intact. Okay. But so far, we just talked about leadership team members, former leadership team members, overseers, and speakers. But let's look at church planters. Maybe this is just on the celebrity culture side. What if the problem is on the celebrity culture side and it's not with church planters? So let's look at some of these church planters. If you've never heard of Tavner Smith, he was one of ARC's most successful church planters. He planted Venue Church in Chattanooga, and for years, they were one of the fastest growing churches in the United States. Okay. Now, Tavner ended up having an affair with a married woman who was allegedly a staff member at the church. Now, again, knowing what we know now, we would say that's not an affair. That's adult clergy SA. Okay. But he wasn't just accused of an affair. He was caught on video looking like he was kissing her at a restaurant. And it was so bad that much of the staff quit. Like a bunch of his staff up and quit because they said, you got to be held accountable for this. Now, we don't know who his overseers were, but from everything that I have heard over the years, it's that his overseers, when all this came out, his overseers quit because they didn't want their names attached to this public scandal. And I'm not going to drop any names because I can't corroborate this because none of us know who these overseers were. But some of the names I've heard are some of the more well-known pastors and speakers in the country. Okay. Again, you would have had really big, successful overseers if you were a big, fast growing, successful church. Tavner was also, he graced stages like Elevation Church's stage. He was a very sought after speaker at the time. Now, here's the deal though. All that happens, it breaks. Your overseers quit, a bunch of your staff quit, and Tavner took just a few weeks off and then he returned. And actually, Tavner was never removed. Why? Because nobody in that governance, there was nobody who could legally remove him. So what happened? Tavner acted like nothing happened, said he was okay, came back. The church ended up, because the giving really struggled, they ended up filing bankruptcy. They ended up changing their name. And guys, the church is still going today. Let me go ahead and pull this up and I'll see if I can show you. The church is still going today. Let me see. Here's some of the stuff with Tavner, by the way, just so you can see it. Here are just some of the headlines. Pastors alleged infidelity causes staff exodus from venue church. Tennessee megachurch pastor accused of affair says he'll be back after a short sabbatical. Venue church shrinking. He returns to the pulpit after a 6-week absence for alleged adultery. Venue facing foreclosure after sex scandal involving pastor. Millions in debt. Venue files for bankruptcy after pastor's alleged misconduct. And then they faced foreclosure. But I want you to look at this. Look at this. This church, Hope House, doesn't look like it's connected to Venue in any way, right? This looks like a really cool church, a church in Georgia, because right where Tavner was pastoring, they were in Chattanooga. They also had a Georgia campus. Okay, they ended up filed for bankruptcy, got those protections. But let's look and let's see who the pastor is of Hope House Church. Our senior pastor, Tavner Smith. Right there, by the way, notice that it's just his girls that are in the picture with him. You're not going to see a wife there because he's now divorced because of everything that happened. Tavner is still pastoring. Nobody ever removed Tavner because in this governance structure, this guy was accused of disqualifying sin and no one could remove him. Within just a few weeks, he was back. And within 6 weeks, he was fully back. And you may just be saying, okay, Jeff, well, maybe that's just a flash in the pan. Maybe that's not normally how this goes. But again, look back at the governance structure. Can you not see how easy this would be to happen? Because if your overseers quit and didn't want to be attached to a scandal, no one else could hold you accountable anyway. But I want you to hear this as well. Let's listen to Dino Rizzo. And if you don't remember, Dino Rizzo was removed for his own affair at the Healing Place Church in Louisiana. But Dino is the executive director of ARC. And let's hear what Dino had to say a few years ago about Tavner while speaking at Venue Church, because it turns out Tavner was very, very involved with ARC.
Just use love, Pastor Tavner and Danielle. Just love them. Love them. So much love and respect and their integrity and the influence that they have. And they are the real deal. I can tell you this about your pastor.
He is really doubling down on their integrity. You got to love Tavner. You got to love, he's got a lot of integrity.
Pastors, they love God and they love you. And I think that's what you want out of a pastor. Can we clap our hands for our pastors and thank God for them?
So this is Dino Rizzo leading ARC, who is having Venue Church round of applause, standing ovation for their pastor because of his integrity. And then he ends up having an adulterous affair, adult clergy, SA, and cannot even be removed from his own ARC church because of this type of governance.
It's so amazing what God has done. And I want you to know that this church and your pastors are a gift to the body of Christ. So we get to help plant churches. And so often those young couples are looking for a model. They're looking for somewhere they can go and learn. And I don't know how often we say you need to be a Venue Church. You need to get around Pastor Tavner, his wife, this team right here. You have an incredible 5-star team here across all the campuses.
All right, so do you hear that? At ARC, we're planning all these churches, and I can't tell you how often we're trying to get these church planners around Tavner. They need to learn from Tavner because Tavner's a good pastor. He's good at growing a church. He's an ARC darling. We want everybody to be around Tavner. So how many of these church planners are learning the same kind of behaviors and how to avoid accountability just like Tavner did?
How you reach out to kids, how you make a difference in the community. And so some of your giving, when you give, and as Jordan talked to us about the 4 ways to give, when you go in and you tithe and you give offerings, the leadership helps kind of disperse that to other couples that want to do this. And so I want you to know this, on September the 16th this year, so over the last 17 years, we planted 776 churches. Think about this. Yeah, that's amazing. This coming
I believe that number is over 1,100 at this point because they planted so many churches and they plant so many a year.
September, on one day, we together, because of the faithfulness of your giving, you go online to give, you text to give, because of the generosity of your pastors, we will plant 38 churches on that one day across the United States, come on, Canada, around the world.
That sounds good, but is planting 38 churches in one day, can you really help hold them accountable? Are you really sure they're ready when 38 churches are planting in one single day?
And you're a part of that. So when you say yes to giving, we get to say yes to couples. And so you're making a huge difference. And I just want to thank you for reflecting the heart of your pastors where you love God and you love people. So these are good days to be alive, getting to serve their ark and help plant church. Pastor Tavner is one of our coaches. And so he's always generous to give of his time to come to Birmingham and meet with young couples, he and his wife, and then get to serve at a great church, Church of the Highlands, like this church.
All right, so did you hear that? Tavner he's talking about ARC, he's talking it up. Tavner's one of our coaches. And these new church planters who are planting, they're learning from Tavner. Tavner's coaching them. And now you see with this kind of governance structure, with all the smoke around the leadership team, and now you see one of the most successful church planters who is so successful, he's become a coach in Tavner Smith. And you see what happened to him. You see the moral failure. You see the grievous sin. And guys, the worst part of this whole thing, Tavner is still preaching. Changed the name of his church. Nobody could remove him. Tavner was essentially ARC's gold standard. And now I think he's one of the biggest warning signs and danger signs to how ARC is doing ministry and this type of governance. Okay. Now, beyond Tavner, you had Jeremy Foster. Jeremy Foster was an ARC church. I believe it's Hope City in Houston, one of the fastest growing churches in the country, very well known, sought after speaker, doing all that stuff. And then he was removed for an adulterous relationship. Didn't just get removed for adultery, but ended up marrying his mistress. You have Ben Tubbs, who we started this whole podcast series talking about at Thrive City Church, that was, caught in sexual sin with himself by a church volunteer, kept it hidden for almost a year, and then appointed 2 offenders on the offenders registry to leadership and put them over control of background checks. You have Mekon Carter. Mekon Carter was one of ARC's darlings, speaking at all of their events. He spoke at ARC events that I was at a few years ago, right? He had a church, I believe, in Yakima, Washington. People wanted him around, okay? They wanted him as a speaker. He was an ARC darling. And then he was forced out of his church, forced to resign because of a moral failure. And later we found out what that moral failure was, what that inappropriate relationship was. Later, his former assistant came out and said what that was she said he raped me. He SA'd me. That was her accusations. Now, I don't know whatever happened from that. I think he sued her for defamation potentially. I've never heard anything about that, but she came out publicly, put herself on the line and said, no, what they said happened. It wasn't just an inappropriate relationship. It was this. Those are very serious accusations. But guess what happened? When Mekon was removed from his church as an ARC church planter, he was brought onto Church of the Highlands staff and was even preaching at Church of the Highlands, friends with Chris Hodges, to be restored until those assistants allegations surfaced. Okay. And then we've got Josh Gagnon as well. Josh Gagnon was accused of bullying and abusive leadership. Okay. He was accused of financial misconduct. And he, as the pastor of Next Level Church, and his entire executive team resigned at one time, okay, and caused thousands of people to be without a church overnight rather than accept accountability. And actually, I think I've got some of those pulled up where I can show you some of those. So I'm not making these up. Yep, you got Jeremy Foster and his news headlines right there. You got Mekon Carter and his news headlines right there. And then you have Josh Gagnon, lead pastor and exec team of ARC Megachurch, resign amid allegations of bullying and financial misconduct. So all of this is public record. And guys, this is not exhaustive. None of this is exhaustive. I'm sure I could pull up more if I looked a little further, but these are just examples that were reasonably easy to put together because I wanted to show you, okay, there's a pattern here, okay? So this is not exhaustive by any nature, but I think it's clear. I think it's clear to see that banking on integrous leaders redeeming the system, banking on the fact that this system will be okay because there's leaders of integrity, that is not a realistic or reasonable solution. I actually think it's safer to assume that all of us are capable of sin. And I think it's much safer to say, because we're all capable of sin, this system needs a lot more guardrails to protect against leaders who falter and leaders who fail. But instead, in this governance system, again, leaders are almost kings, monarchs with unchecked power. I think we've seen time and time again, this soil is ripe for allowing scandal to grow. And I just think ARC has to be careful. And before, man, we continue to support ARC churches and stuff like that, I think Christians, we've got to say, we require more out of you. There has to be more accountability. There has to be more transparency. There has to be more protective systems in place. You can't just run around with unchecked power when we've already seen that there's too many concerns, too many people have been hurt to not do something differently. And guys, when it comes to really important safety factors like transparency, accountability, and protective systems, and that's what the Safe Church Pledge through the Spiritual Abuse Institute is built around: transparency, accountability, and protective systems. When it comes to those things, ARC, in my opinion, seems woefully behind. And honestly, I said it's my opinion. The reality is it's probably not just my opinion, because I think if you look at it, it's hard to say it's anything other than an established pattern. Because what I see when I look at ARC's lead team and former overseers, the conflicts of interest with their lead team, the former speakers around them, their church planners, what I see is I see patterns that emerge. I see patterns of nepotism, pattern after pattern after pattern. It's not just one example of nepotism or two, it's a pattern. I see patterns of opaque governance where it's hard to even tell what the governance is. I don't know what questions to ask because you're so opaque about your governance. And I see a pattern of cookie cutter approaches. And what I mean by cookie cutter approaches is we're all using kind of the same strategy and similar mission statements and the same systems. And regardless of what you know about our governance or anything else, you can tell we're running the same church growth playbook, the same cookie cutter systems that, hey, when you're running a church like that and you're growing fast, remember that elder from Thrive City, remember that church ARC church planning coordinator from Thrive City that said, hey man, this system works, it's going to grow, but it grows so fast these people, their integrity can't handle it. That's the cookie cutter systems that you know are going to work. So here's what I looked at. I looked at both the churches of the lead team members, okay, and I looked at current lead team members and a couple of former lead team members. And I also looked at, I think it was the last like 44 or something like that. But looked at it between 40 and 45 of their most recent ARC church plants. And I looked for patterns. And here's what I found. Okay. When it comes to governance transparency, only out of the churches that are ran by ARC lead team members, only 2 of the 26 churches I looked at, that is 8%. 2 churches and 8% actually were transparent about the type of governance that they had. Okay, so we looked at a Church of the Highlands where they said we're guided by pastors, we're protected by trustees, and then we're held accountable by overseers or whatever it was. Okay, something as simple as that didn't exist at most of these churches. 8% were transparent about their governance. Okay, now when they were transparent about their governance, was it ARC governance? Was it real accountability, or was it that ARC governance that promises accountability but really has very little to none? Okay, 100%. Okay, 100% looked like it was either ARC governance or unclear. Okay, so out of the 8% that told us what their governance was, it was ARC playbook. That's what it looked like. The rest of them were completely unclear. All right, we talk about cookie cutter strategy. It's going to be things like when a church says our strategy or our mission is to know God, find freedom, discover purpose, and make a difference, or something very similar, that's a cookie cutter strategy. That's not only Church of the Highlands strategy and mission, but that's ARC's. And when you start looking at ARC churches, you're going to find a lot of churches that have copied and pasted that exactly. Growth track, freedom, all the stuff alike. You're hearing the exact same language because it's just been copied and pasted. Now, why do they copy and paste these cookie cutter systems this way? Well, the reason is because they work. If you want to grow a church, if you want to launch large and you want to start big and stay big, these things are going to work. But you realize really quick, these are churches that they're not so much hearing their strategy and mission from God. They're copying and pasting it out of a playbook, and the same playbook that brought us a governance system that essentially makes pastors kings. Okay, so when I looked for markers of that cookie cutter strategy, public markers of this, 13 out of the 26, 50% of the leadership team churches were using what looked to be a cookie cutter strategy. And then one of the last things that we asked churches on the Safe Church Pledge to do, because it's very important, okay? It's important that you disclose what your affiliations are. So these churches, we know they're all affiliated with ARC. Are they disclosing that they're affiliated with ARC? If a person didn't know what to look for, would they know that this is an ARC church? Only 4 out of the 26 churches, 15%, disclose their affiliation with ARC or any other affiliations. Okay. But you may say, Jeff, I'm sure that's the ARC lead team. They're fully bought into ARC, but I bet most ARC churches aren't that bad. But if that's what you say, sadly, I think you're going to be surprised because, again, I looked at their 44 most recent church plants. You may say, Jeff, why 44? I looked at every church plant that I could find that was planted in the last year. That was the aim, okay? So 44 churches, only 7 out of the 44 most recent ARC church plants were transparent about their governance, okay? 16% were transparent about their governance structure, telling us we have overseers, trustees, elders, that sort of thing. That means 84%, the vast majority, were completely unclear and opaque about their governance. I would say, looking at lead team and the church plants, I would say that constitutes a troubling pattern, okay? But let's ask, out of the ones that did publicly disclose their governance, 86% of them fit the ARC model. So out of the ones that told us, man, 86% were ARC governance. They're just copying and pasting, it looks like, ARC governance. Speaking of copying and pasting, 18 of the 44 most recent church plants, 41%, so a little under half, 41% had publicly adopted the Church of the Highlands mission and strategy. That doesn't mean the others aren't running it, but I'm saying 41%, it's right there on their website using the same exact language. And the vast majority of these church plants were publicly employing ARC systems like Growth Track, Freedom, Kingdom Builders, all of that stuff. At some level, they were using these ARC systems, and you can actually see that publicly. And then the final thing to look out, how many of these most recent church plants disclosed their affiliations, especially their affiliation with ARC. Would you know that these are ARC churches, okay? Only 3 out of the 44. That is 7%. 3 out of the 44 and 7% disclosed that they were connected to ARC. So if you didn't know, if you didn't ask, if you didn't know what to look for, you would be completely caught off guard, okay? Because it's not just the patterns of opaque governance. It's not just the patterns and the ties to scandal. It's not just those concerning patterns. Another pattern that is just as concerning to me is how big of a business all of this has become. Because when church becomes a big business with big numbers, guess what? You also get big accountability concerns. And the reality is that ARC has become a massive corporate business, okay? And it starts new big businesses every single year in a perpetual ministry machine. Because when you're starting churches that are averaging, I think about 344 people on launch day is what they've been averaging recently. When you do that, that is huge for a church, considering that the majority of churches will never grow past 200. ARC is starting churches that are some of the biggest churches in the country day one. That is their whole strategy. Now, and look, it's all good. We'd love to see more people come to Jesus. Big churches, I'm not saying big churches are bad. Here's the problem, though. Big business has never been known for integrity. Okay, when you look at those bylaws talking about the president and the CEO, the pastor being the president, the CEO of the corporation, you start looking at how much like a business this is operating and how they're starting one big corporation after a time. Guys, when the church starts acting like a big business, we're going to share in the same failures of big business. So I want to hear just a little bit more from Stovall Weems. We're going to hear 2 more things from Stovall, and that'll be all that we hear from him. But I want you to hear a little bit more from him, and then I want us to talk about how much big business has crept into ARC and churches like it.
You know, Celebration Church, we were always one of the largest churches in the country, and many years we were one of the fastest growing churches. And that's the craziness about all of this.
At its peak, how big was its revenue?
So at its peak, I would say just the church was taking in between 25 and 30 million a year. And then with its auxiliaries, it was taking in about 45 to 50 million a year. It was a big business.
All right. So again, Stovall saying the quiet part out loud. He says it was a big business. And did you hear when Nathan asked him, how much money were you taking in? At first, he felt uncomfortable answering it. He's like, that's not a question you normally answer in these circles. But he said some telling things. He said, we're probably the church, a $35 million budget. But he said, and if you listen to the Religion Business IQ series, they go much deeper into this. But when we're talking about auxiliaries, when he said when you count the auxiliaries, it was closer to 50 million. Well, the auxiliaries are essentially shell companies, smaller 501c2 corporations, nonprofits of their own that don't have to disclose their finances, don't have to tell donors, don't have to tell the government because they're considered a church, but they're operating under the umbrella of Celebration, and you would have never known that was part of the church. But he says all of that together, $50 million, $15 million a year was likely hidden in auxiliaries that people didn't even know were a part of the church, or if they knew they were a part of the church, they didn't know that was separate money from what was being disclosed to the church. So he says it was a big business with a really big budget. Okay, so when I say we're talking about big business, we're talking about really big business. I'm going to show you how big in just a moment. We're not just going to listen to Stovall and take his word for it, but listen to the business model of ARC, because Stovall is going to break that down. The church isn't just big business with these ARC churches. It wasn't just his church, but the ARC model is taking advantage of that big business.
So how the model would work would be this. A pastor wants to go plant a church, in whatever city of town. So he would come to ARC and say, I want to be an ARC church and I want to plant a church in my city. He would have to raise half, and then ARC would come in and match up to 50,000.
Sounds kind of like an MLM. You pass money up the value chain to the people that brought you on.
Well, I would say this, okay? If you're looking at it from a pure business model, right or wrong, from a pure business model, it's something. Because
from a pure business model, he says it's something. It's something because it works. If you're looking at it from a pure business model, these guys are brilliant because this is really good business. The question is it good church? Is it healthy church? And is it safe church?
These churches that get planted, the first thing they do is pay back that loan, right? Of their 10% for missions, they pay back that loan. But then they're tied.
Now, did you hear that? That's something important as well. He says the first thing they do is pay back their loan. There's no news there, okay? But he said that in their 10% from missions, they pay back that loan. Most people don't know this, but a lot of your ARC churches, they're going to give, just like other churches, it's all the rage now to not give you pure numbers, but to give you a 4 or 5 piece pie chart at the end of the year as an annual report. We tell you how much went to salaries, how much went to ministry, how much went to missions and all of that. Okay. Now, in that number that these churches are telling you goes to missions, Stovall just said, and I've seen this with other churches we've investigated, a lot of times the money that goes to missions is going to organizations like ARC. And hey, we gave this much to missions, but we're not going to tell you what percentage that actually just went back as kickbacks and helping support our friends' different ministries that we're calling missions.
Into ARC at 2% giving for the perpetuity.
So they have to pay. So if I'm an ARC church and I raise $1 million a year, I have to give 2% of that million to ARC, to the ARC headquarters?
Yes, if ARC planted you. So if you were taking in $1 million a year, you'd be given $20,000 every year to ARC.
So I have a question. If I decided not to give that $20,000 to ARC, what would they do?
The way that it's set up is, the loan's paid back, and then you're free and clear. If you wanted to, hey, I don't want to be part of ARC any longer. It's funny I'm saying this now with a different filter. If you don't want to be part of ARC any longer, well, you're free to leave, I think.
And the reason why he says, I think, looking at it with a different filter, is because Stovall says he was forced out by ARC leaders when he didn't want to play their game anymore. Okay. But I want you to think about this business model. Okay. We plant churches. We give you up to $50,000. Recently, they've actually, I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, just recently, they've decided to give up to $100,000. We give you a $50,000 loan. We give you all the systems. If you run our system, you run our playbook, You're going to start with over 300 people. You're going to be able to pay the loan back fast. You're going to start with all the flash, all the lights, all the stuff. Okay. So you start out, but for the perpetuity of you being a church, as long as you're a part of ARC, once you pay back that 50,000, now you're paying 2% of your annual revenue as a corporation, as a church, for the perpetuity of the life of your church. Unless you leave ARC, you're paying that back to us. We're taking that money in and we're planting more churches who pay back their small loan and then pay back a ton more money. And guys, this is a perpetual ministry machine because you're always bringing in a whole lot more money from those churches than they actually spent. And then where is that money going? Well, you would assume that part of it is going to those speakers and the conflict of interest and everything else, because we've seen there's a lot of money flowing, but also, if I'm not mistaken, and you could help me check this out, the only way we can know for sure is Church of the Highlands would have to tell us, okay? But I'm pretty sure that ARC is an association and convention of Church of the Highlands, okay? Because they don't have to fill out a 990 because they're considered a church, which means if ARC is an association and convention of Church of the Highlands, money can just funnel between those bank accounts and nobody has to say a word, okay? So it brings up a lot more questions, in my opinion. But keeping with the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability that we've seen so far, guys, because remember, only 2 of the 23 churches represented on the lead team, okay? I want you to think about this. Only 2 of those 23 churches from the lead team are members of the ECFA, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability. And because churches don't have to fill out a 990 form, because churches don't have to disclose their finances to their donors like all other secular nonprofits do, okay? One of the workarounds that the government gave them to allow churches to keep doing that was back in like the 60s and 70s, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability was formed. And the Religion Business docuseries, again, I highly recommend watching it. They talk about how it was formed, okay? And the whole point was that the ECFA, we create this, it will govern us, okay? But all they actually show, and let me go ahead, I'll just share the screen and I will show you here. All the ECFA shows, this is ARC's ECFA page, all they show under financial data is the total revenue, essentially the total expenses, excess deficit, and then your total and net liabilities. They're not actually showing a lot at all. When you look at a 990, just to kind of show you the difference, when you look at a 990, you're often looking at like 18 pages or more. You see how they're spending all their money in programs, has a ton of line items. You see anybody in that nonprofit on the 990 who makes more than $100,000 a year, and you see their exact salary, you see housing allowances, you see all of that. All secular nonprofits like the Spiritual Abuse Institute, we have to fill out those forms. And actually, for us, we give more information than is required by the 990 on our website every year and to our donors. Okay. But again, if you're an ECFA member, all you got to do is show your total revenue and net revenue. Okay. And then your total assets and net assets. Do an audit to say we're not doing anything crazy illegal. And that is it. Okay. So it's not a lot of accountability. And the Religion Business docuseries talks about how little accountability that brings. But even with that little bit of accountability, only 2 of the 23 churches represented on ARC's lead team are even members of the ECFA. Like when I looked up their information, I could only find 2 churches. So financial data on these ARC lead team churches is really hard to find. But like I said, ARC itself is an ECFA member, but I couldn't find Church of the Highlands. So, Church of the Highlands, like I said, is essentially the parent company of ARC, but I couldn't find any of their stuff, just ARC's. But let's look at the few pieces of financial data that I could find about ARC and its lead team churches on the ECFA so we can see how big of a business this is. So here's ARC. ARC's total revenue from the last year, from 2024, was $16.28 million. Okay. So you actually see that $16.28 million. Their net assets, and by net assets, I mean when we pay all of our bills, we take care of all of our liabilities, the assets is what's left over. And that's not just buildings and equipment, but it's cash in the bank. Okay. It's all of it. Their net assets for ARC is $31.6 million. $31.6 million for this church planting organization. And based on what I understand, right? So thinking about the max loan number of 50,000 and the max number of churches that they plant in a calendar year, okay? ARC would have probably only spent about 2 million, okay, on planting churches. They would have only spent about 2 million out of that 16.28 that they brought in on planting churches. And in the years that they planted 100 churches, they would have only given loans up to about 5 million based on my math. Now, I'm not good at math. Double check me on that. But it doesn't look like church planting would have even come anywhere near half of the money that they brought in and half of the money that they spent. So this is pretty wild. This is a really big business, but it's not just ARC. Let's look at Seacoast, Greg Surratt's church. And I will give them credit. I'm really glad that Seacoast was one of the few churches, one of the 2 churches who I could find on ECFA. But let's go ahead and let's look at Seacoast's financial data. All right, you see right here, their total revenue, $37.26 million. Okay, their excess was $5 million. $5 million they didn't even spend. And we don't know where they spent the rest of that money because there's no disclosures. But $5 million that they didn't spend, what's their net assets? After they pay all their bills and they shut down, what would their net assets be if they shut down today? It would be a payout of $57.53 million. Now, let's think about this. They're an ARC church. Greg Surratt, the lead of ARC, his son, more nepotism, now runs this church, okay? The estimated ARC payment based on this $57 million, their estimated ARC payment from Seacoast to ARC in 2024 would have been $745,000. $745,000, $745,000 paid out of their missions budget, according to Stovall Weems, to ARC. So are you starting to see why this is a big business? So now let's look at the only other ARC church that I could find on ECFA, and that's Celebration Church. Now, this is not the same Celebration Church as Stovall Weems. That's ARC Church is a Celebration Church in Jacksonville, I believe. This Celebration Church is the Celebration Church in Texas that is led and pastored by Joe Champion. You saw Joe is currently on the lead team. Let's look at their financial data. How big of a business is this? You see that their total revenue in 2024 was $29.23 million. Let's look at their let's look at their excess. They had an almost $7 million excess. They couldn't spend enough money to get rid of it all. So they had a $7 million excess. And you may say, Jeff, big church, big business, they've got to have reserves, right? And if you go down here, it always tells you nonprofits need operating reserves. And as a nonprofit founder and executive director, I understand that nonprofits need reserves. We try to keep, 5,000-6,000 in reserves at all time. We'd like to raise that a little bit, especially for legal expenses and stuff like that. But do you really need $7 million in a year that you're not spending when you already have net assets? After all your bills are paid, your reserves, your net assets are $37 million, $37.16 million. Do you really need $7 million a year that you're just saving back on top of that? And with this kind of revenue, what would Celebration Church's estimated ARC payment have been? It would have been $584,000. Okay, so over $500,000 for Celebration Church. Now, Church of the Highlands, I would love to show you Church of the Highlands numbers because they're one of the top 3 biggest churches in the country. Okay, depending on who you talk to, depends on how big of a church that they are. They're massive. Okay, but since we don't have any financial data for them, because one of the largest churches in the country and the leader of ARC, they don't provide any of that. Let's use the available numbers we have for a comparable top church. I want to look at Life Church in Oklahoma, led by Craig Rochelle, because it's one of the other largest churches in the country. And all we can do is look at comparable financial data. So you see Life.Church. Okay. Life Church's total revenue in 2024 was $265 million. $265 million. Well, let's look at their assets. What were their total assets? $531 million. When they pay all the bills and liquidate all the assets, what are they left with? $531 million. So let's say Church of the Highlands is anywhere near this, because this is just a comparable church. Okay. If Church of the Highlands made in the same year what Life Church made, the estimated ARC payment would have been $5.3 million, because 2% would have been $5.3 million. That's what they would have paid back to ARC. And guys, every ARC church that is planted, okay, think about this. Every ARC church that is planted with somewhere around 350 people right now. They literally launch big, launch large, start big, stay big. If we're thinking about around 350 people when you start, they only grow from there. They pay back their loan. Every single one of those churches is expected to pay 2% of their revenue annually. And remember, we heard until they slowed down just a little bit because of scandal, they were planning about 100 churches a year. That's 100 churches a year, starting big, paying back their loans fast, and then they're on the hook for 2% of their revenue annually once their loans are paid back, as long as they're a part of ARC. Guys, Nathan said it. It sounds kind of like an MLM. That's like a church planting MLM with Church of the Highlands at the top. And it is very concerning to me. That is huge business. But not only is it big business, this will be the final thing that we talk about in this particular look at ARC, but it's the final concern. Not only is this a big business, not only have they been tied to a lot of scandals and question and immoral behavior, not only do they have a governance structure that seems like it would be very easy for someone to go off the rails and very difficult to hold somebody accountable. Beyond all of that, what continues to concern me is that it's not just that big business. It's not just those other concerns. This is also a ministry machine that, by all accounts, it looks like they would threaten legal action if you tried to have transparent conversations. Okay. And here's what I'm talking about. Let me go ahead. I'll share my screen again. This might seem really, really boring, but when I say we've looked pretty deeply into ARC, this right here is part of ARC's terms and conditions and their privacy policy. Okay. Their privacy policy, because, and it's not ARC, it's Church of the Highlands, because when you go to Church of the Highlands has resources, grow resources now that you can get. So you can sign up for an account for free on their website, and then you can get a lot of their systems, a lot of their resources. And I think that stuff used to be on ARC. Now it's on Church of the Highlands. Okay. But before you do that, you have to actually accept these terms and conditions. And a lot of people don't accept these terms and conditions. A couple of years ago, I wanted to do an episode or two where we did deep dives into ARC systems so I could show you, because guys, I have been in the room with leaders like Chris Hodges and Mark Pettis. I've heard the Kingdom Builders spill. I've heard all these systems. I have been in these rooms. There's stuff that I would love to be able to share with you. But the problem is I can't share it with you, because when I looked at their terms and conditions, you see things like this. Now, again, legal language, but let's look at what this means. Notwithstanding anything to the contrary herein, Church of the Highlands reserves the right to terminate and revoke all or some of the rights if, in the event that Church of the Highlands believes in its sole discretion, doesn't matter if they can prove it, doesn't matter. If they believe in their sole discretion that your use or intended use of the content may be inconsistent with Church of the Highlands' message or, catch this, threatens harm to its reputation or goodwill. Not only can they revoke your account, but you're going to see here in a moment, they can take legal action. Okay. And it's right there in the terms of services. You have to agree that you're not going to use this stuff in any way that could threaten to harm their reputation or goodwill. Well, I can't go in there and grab any of these systems to show you some of the things that concern me. I can't walk you deeper through these systems as much as I would love to. I can't do that as a watchdog organization. We can't do that so that we can shed some light on some of these concerns. We can't do that because it could be perceived as them as threatening their reputation and goodwill, because they're going to look at a podcast like this and go, he's threatening our reputation. He's threatening our goodwill. And I'm not trying to threaten ARC at all. I'm not trying to hurt ARC at all. What I'm saying is, ARC, you got to get your act together, because your systems and your governance and your way of planting churches seems very dangerous to me. And it seems way too tied to spiritual abuse, sin, scandal, or moral behavior for me to feel comfortable with. Okay. You have too much influence for that. So I would say it's a good thing for the church for us to have these conversations. But they would likely say, and again, it's in their sole discretion, if it threatens harm to their reputation or goodwill, they can terminate the account. They could come after you by using this site. You agree that if you're contacted by Church of the Highlands about improper use of the content that violates this license, you and your church will make every effort to correct any improper use. Okay. And it tells you where you would have to remove things from. Okay. So that's just a little bit of stuff right there. It's just a little bit of stuff. But guys, if you're not paying attention to this, you wouldn't realize this. We have to pay attention to this stuff. And I knew what I was looking for. And when I read this, I recognized this. I took this and perceived this as a whistleblower organization, as a threat. I perceived it as a threat that if we tried to share things about those systems, the stuff they had publicly available, and we tried to bring public transparency, that they could come after us. Okay. Because this clause, in my opinion, from my vantage point, and I'm not a lawyer, I could be wrong, but from my vantage point, clauses like this give Church of the Highlands unilateral power. They can take away access, they can pursue legal consequences if they even believe, if they even think that how you're using this stuff, if you're just talking about what's actually there and why it would concern you, they think it harms their reputation. Okay, so that could apply to investigative reporting. That could apply to survivor testimony about Church of the Highlands or ARC material, and it could apply to an analysis of ARC systems based on training content. So we did talk about Growth Track. So you may be saying, Jeff, why did y'all talk about Growth Track? Because we talked about Growth Track in a previous episode. But the only reason we talked about Growth Track is because Growth Track materials are publicly available on Church of the Highlands website. You don't have to have this account. You don't have to go in the back end. They've got those publicly available. So we were able to find that and talk about it. Okay. But you may say, Jeff, all this legalese, why is it dangerous? Okay. Well, there's no clear definition of what would harm their reputation. Okay. So that means that even good faith transparency could trigger consequences. It could trigger legal action, which means we won't talk about some of these systems and some of these documents and some of this stuff. There's things that I would like to share with you because I do have concerns about it that I wouldn't feel would be safe to do. And so here's what this does. And this is, we look at this with NDAs as well. It's one of the reasons why we're so against NDA use in the church, because legal clauses and phrases like this, they whether you mean to or not, they create what's called a chilling effect. Okay. A chilling effect is the effect, it's a clause that makes people afraid to speak truthfully because fear of facing legal threats or fear of losing. Okay. And again, I feel like when they talk about you and your church using this in a way that could hurt us, I feel like this frames transparency as misuse. But that's not the only concern, because you're also going to see right here a little later on in the terms of service, it says you agree that any violation by you of these terms will constitute an unlawful and unfair business practice. Okay. They say if you violate any of these terms, it constitutes an unlawful and unfair business practice, which means if you talk about anything, use these in any way that may harm their reputation, now it constitutes contractually an unfair and unlawful business practice because it will cause irreparable harm to us for which monetary damages would be inadequate. Okay. And you consent to us obtaining any injunctive or equitable relief that we deem necessary in these circumstances. What does that mean? If you use these in a way that you don't want, we're going to sue you for unlawful and unfair business practices because you caused us irreparable harm and you couldn't pay us enough money to make it worth it. So we'll take you to court and have the right to take you to court and try to take everything that you own. That creates a chilling effect. That feels like a threat to anyone who would just talk openly about these systems in a way that may not make Church of the Highlands or ARC look good. And then under indemnity, you agree to indemnify and hold Church of the Highlands and our pastor, staff, overseers, elders, directors, employees, agents, subsidiaries, and affiliates harmless from any demands, loss, liability, claims, expenses, including attorney's fees. Want to make sure that you're paying those attorney's fees made against the indemnified parties by any third party to or arising out of or in connection with your use of the site and content. And also, this is important, your breach of this license or use of content. So when you accept these terms and conditions, you're saying, I'm not going to use any of this in any way that could cause you reputational harm, that could cause you damage. And that's totally what you think causes you damage. And if I do, you can basically, I'm telling you, you can sue me into oblivion because I'm causing you irreparable harm. It's talking about it as unfair business practices. So what are the practical implications of this? These policies, this terms and use agreement, whether they meant to or not, it looks like a quiet but really aggressive form of information control. And while they may present it as routine copyright protections, the reality is it functions as institutional safeguards that control the narrative, block any sort of dissent from anybody, prevent accountability and transparency, and it serves to legally intimidate anybody who would expose concerns with any of these systems. Okay. And guys, that's even more concerning when you realize these resources are used to train hundreds of ARC affiliated churches. And there are churches that aren't even a part of ARC, probably thousands more that use these resources. Okay. So, but we can't public report on that. We can't talk about them. We can't say what's the good and bad to these systems because you've got this chilling sounding legal agreement. Okay. And it's not just talking about using these things out of copyright, but it's basically saying fair use and other legal uses, you can't do it now. Okay. So to me, this isn't just about media copyright. It's about a powerful media machine trying to keep people who would potentially ask questions quiet. And that really concerns me. So here are my biggest concerns as we land the plane on this in-depth look at ARC. And again, guys, this was originally just going to be me looking at Thrive City and what Emma went through. And it was going to be looking at just the dangers of that, how we could avoid that. But then I realized I can't talk about this one scandal without talking about how many other scandals and questions and failures and hurt people are in a line behind ARC. And I can't talk about that. I can't talk about this one without looking at the governance structure and saying the governance issues that led to this one, they don't just exist in this one church, they exist in many ARC churches because this is the governance that they advocate for, according to Peter Haas. But it's not just that. These are patterns. These aren't isolated incidences, but when you start looking, you start seeing repeatable patterns of these sort of things from lead team members, former overseers, former lead team members, speakers who were at the church, new church planters. You don't just see those patterns, but you see conflicts of interest, galore conflicts of interest that might serve to keep people quiet about potential corruption in these places. You don't just see that, but you see a big business and a lot of people who stand to gain from this big business millions of dollars. Anywhere from, we're looking at like $20 million of net assets to $531 million in net assets. You have these big businesses and numbers and associations and conventions and shell companies and everything else that exist and benefit from ARC, but then they also ARC benefits from them because of what kind of looks like a kickback and 2% payments in perpetuity. We got this MLM looking marketing system. And then on top of that, looking at something as benign as the terms and use agreement on their resources page has chilling language that could feel like a threat to anybody who's wanting to talk about this stuff. It feels like they're trying to control the narrative. When you bring all of it together, guys, here's all I can say. Again, am I trying to say the ARC needs to shut down? Not at all. Am I trying to say that everything about ARC is bad? No. I'm not even saying that every ARC church is bad. Okay? There are ARC churches I've heard wonderful things about. I have friends and people I trust and care about who are a part of ARC churches. But I can tell you, as someone who's been inside the system, who's been hurt by the systems, as someone who hears stories of people who feel like they have been chewed up and spit out by these systems every day, I couldn't just talk about Thrive City without helping you take a little bit deeper of a look at ARC. Because while there are good things at ARC, here is my fear, and I'm going to be as clear as I know to be. My opinion, my fear is that if ARC doesn't intentionally embrace a greater level of transparency, accountability, and protective systems, we're only going to see more spiritual abuse. We're only going to see significantly more religious trauma. We're only going to see more moral failures and pastors removed. And if anything, if they don't go more toward transparency and accountability, my fear is that they're going to go the other way. My fear is that they'll go the other way to try to double down and silence more and protect more and keep more information behind the books and have less accountability so that they're protected from these things. And guys, I don't want any more of these scandals to come out, but I don't want them hidden either. And I thought it was important for you to know because if you are a pastor, and I'm just going to talk to a few different people as we close this out. If you're a pastor of an ARC church, or you're a staff member or a pastor at an ARC church, I would just ask you, looking at that governance system, looking at your own bylaws, look at it from the point of an advocate, of a whistleblower, of a victim. Why would you not want more accountability than that? Why would you not? And guys, my hope is that there's some pastors who are listening right now who, instead of taking this as an attack on you, instead of taking this as an attack on ARC, what I would love more than anything else is for ARC churches to start standing up and taking the Safe Church Pledge and saying, we love ARC systems. We're glad that they've helped us connect with people and grow. If that's what you want out of church, go ahead and do that. But we're going to take steps the ARC doesn't ask us to take. We're going to go above and beyond to build intentional systems and to invite accountability into our churches. That's what would be my hope. So if you're a pastor or a staff member, would you start asking these questions? Would you take steps toward providing more intentional accountability, protection, and transparency in your church? If you're a person who goes to our church, I'm not asking you to leave your church. What I'm asking you to do, if these answers aren't publicly available, would you ask your church to see their bylaws? Would you find out about their governance? And no matter how good it sounds, check to see if that governance that sounds good is this problematic governance that is so often taught in ARC. Those constitution and bylaws that we talked about, is the accountability real or does it just sound good? Do you know financial information about your church, right? Do you know the checks and balances? Does the congregation have any say so? Do you know who to report stuff to if something goes wrong? Do you know there are systems in place that would absolutely hold your pastor accountable if something went wrong? If you can find those answers, fantastic. I would love to hear about it and I would love to celebrate that church. But if you don't know those answers, I would encourage you to fight for those answers, to ask for those answers in good faith. And if you can't find them, I would encourage you that may not be a healthy or safe church, no matter how much you love it, no matter how good the pastor is, how good of a speaker they are, no matter how good of programs it has. I think we all have to play a role in keeping people safe. And if you're not a staff member at an ARC church, you don't go to an ARC church, I would ask you to consider, would you take the things that you've learned from this, and when you're checking out new churches, you have friends and family who are checking out new churches, would you look for some of these things? And would you look to support, give your time and give your money only to churches that are pro-transparency, pro-accountability? And if you see some of these red flags, I'm not asking you not to go to those churches. I'm asking you, would you ask questions and find answers before you blindly support those churches? Okay, because guys, I'm just tired of hearing people's lives and futures and faith affected by a lack of accountability in churches. These are real people like Emma who are on the other end of all of these stories. And guys, I am heartbroken over how common this has become. So wherever you're at, whatever you can do, would you join us in asking ARC and its churches and its lead team to take intentional steps to fight for more transparency, accountability, and protective systems? Because the people in our churches, they're people Jesus died for, they're people Jesus loves, they are people who matter deeply to God. And because of that, they should matter to us. So before we do anything else, before we worry about church growth and all of that, can we make sure that the people that we're reaching, the people we're introducing to Jesus, that they're also protected, and they're going to be protected as sheep under good under shepherds while they're in our care? And I don't think that that's too much to ask, but let me know if you've stayed and you've watched this all the way through. We've talked about a lot. What questions do you have? What concerns do you have? Where do you think we got it right? Where do you think we missed it? Let me know, but don't just attack. especially if you're a person who's pro church of the Highlands, pro arc. Don't just attack, join conversation. Let's have real conversation about these issues, because even if we don't agree at the end of the day on these issues, I think we can all agree there's too much scandal, too much sin, too much spiritual abuse in the church today, and we can and we should do better. So let me know in the comments below your thoughts on how we can do better.